I'm Dr. Dave Janda. Welcome back to the Insider Insight Show. In this day and age of the geopolitical morass that we're involved in on a 24/7 basis, I cannot think of a better person, let alone expert, to have with me in the geopolitical world than our friend, freedom's friend, the world's friend, Harley Schlanger. And Harley tells you what you need to know. It's definitely not what the City of London, the deep state, whatever you want to call it, wants you to know about. And you might not particularly want to hear the truth that Harley delivers. But it's the truth. And the truth that Harley delivers puts you not days or weeks, but months and years ahead of the curve, which is critical. My biggest concern right now for the new year, folks, is many people believe that with what happened on November 5th, 2024, that it's game, set, and match. It's done. Back to the couch, back to figuring out what time the game's on, and back to figuring out who's going to be on The Bachelor or Bachelorette or whatever trash TV we're talking about. And that's a very legitimate concern based on what I'm hearing from folks that get in touch with me. Because this is far from over. And that's not fear porn. It's being truthful. There's a tremendous amount going on even in front of the curtain, let alone behind the curtain, that could adversely affect every person in this world. And that's why Harley Schlanger's input is so important for each one of us. Harley has been the spokesperson for LaRouche since 1999. He's written extensively on many issues, geopolitical issues, financial fraud, the lack of a productive manufacturing economy, which morphed into a speculative casino economy. Harley's interviewed on radio programs, television programs, topics throughout the world. And that's Harley's level of expertise, worldwide geopolitical knowledge that puts everyone ahead of the curve who's willing to listen. You can follow Harley's fantastic work at LaRoucheOrganization.com. It's my pleasure and honor to welcome back Harley Schlanger. Harley, welcome back.
Well, thank you, Dave. That was a nice introduction.
Well, thank you for all your work, Harley. And Harley, is Dave just being negative? Is Dave just, looking at the glass being half empty when I say that, okay, yeah, November 5th was important, but it's not the end. And what the syndicate wants is for all of us to go back to the couch and essentially stand down. Am I off on that assessment?
Well, I think if we start back just a little bit and get a sense of what actually happened on November 5th, that will answer your question. Because what happened is the cumulative effect of the condescending arrogance of the establishment drove people to the polls. And in particular, what happened was that when people were being told that if they support Trump, they're racist, they're misogynists, they're anti-Semites, they're whatever. When you're talking to people about people who are suffering the effects of inflation, who don't know for sure if they can get food on the table or a roof over the head or clothing for their children, and then you tell them it's not inflation, the economy's good, it's strong, and that they're just griping or victims, that caused a visible reaction in whole sections of the country. And it affected different ethnic groups, different racial groups. It was, and I'm watching this from Germany, and I see the same thing here, where you have an establishment that's completely disconnected with the struggles of the everyday person. Now, that's the cause of the problem. And that didn't go away by the election. The election didn't suddenly cause the billionaires to say, oh, gee, we are arrogant, we are condescending, we have to do a little bit better. If anything, they might say we have to do better PR. Or perhaps choose a better candidate than Kamala Harris or Joe Biden. So the problem goes back before November 5th. Now, what happened on November 5th was something that does give you a sense of hope that people will fight if there's leadership. But what we've seen since then has been a kind of mix of events, with Trump trying to put together a cabinet, some of which I think is fairly good because it scares the hell out of the deep state. The Gates appointment, for example, I'm sorry that one didn't work.
Yeah, me too.
But he was a real fighter on Russiagate. Kash Patel with Devin Nunes were heroes in my eyes in the fight they waged against the corruption of the Brennans and the McCabe's and the Comeys and so on. So there's some bright spots, but at the same time, we have creepy Joe Biden, who's still sitting there, but he's not really pulling the strings. It's still Blinken, it's Sullivan. Remember, Jake Sullivan is the guy who wrote to Hillary Clinton in 2012, Al-Qaeda is on our side in Syria. These are the people who are still making policy. And they've made a decision to create the worst possible circumstance for Trump to come in as president, to swamp him with crises, with wars, with escalation, with economic problems. We're seeing inflation coming back, if it ever was really stopped. So I think your point is not that people should be negative, but reflect back on how happy you were on November 6th, when we saw the crushing defeat of the Democrats, but realize we still have allies of those Democrats in the Republican Senate caucus and the Republican House caucus. The NeoCons are not gone, and they're not going to give up without a fight. And so neither can we. We can't sit on the couch and drink beer and eat popcorn and jump up and down and watch the Senate hearings or a football game or something else. We've got to be alert and on our toes. And so I think that's what you're basically saying, and I think that's very good advice.
And Harley, in the first Trump administration, there were hundreds of terrible appointments of deep state players in and around the president whom adversely affected, in addition to the extrinsic problems with the Russia fake collusion, the hoax and everything. But he unfortunately was surrounded by a number of syndicate players who were there to act as speed bumps to block the progress of the freedom movement. Harley, you mentioned the current nominees. Give us your take on a couple of them on the good, the bad, the ugly.
Well, to go back to 2016, to have a slight historical reflection of the problem, what happened at that point is that you had the permanent bureaucracy, besides the bad appointments, like Steve Mnuchin, I think, was a terrible appointment at Treasury.
Goldman Sachs.
All the generals who were on the White House staff.
Kelly.
The Justice Department was not cleaned out.
No.
Where is the power of the permanent bureaucracy? It's in the Justice Department, the intelligence community, the Defense Department. Those are the primary areas that determine the direction of the country. And essentially what happened is that Trump was blindsided by some of the people he selected, but was not able to go in and clean out some of these permanent bureaucrats who are there essentially doing the duties for the corporate cartels in expectation that when they leave, they'll have a nice job, they'll have a corporate board membership and things of that sort. So I would say that from what we've seen of his current appointees, he's learned something from that. You look at the people, that Matt Gaetz as an example of someone who's very loyal, but so is Pam Bondi, the person who he chose to replace Gaetz as Attorney General. Patel is, I think, very strong. I'm hopeful Tulsi Gabbard gets through the confirmation process. There's no one who's perfect for these positions, but you see in Gabbard someone who fought against the neocons in the Democratic Party. She knows the nature of the Hillary Clinton crowd from the inside, and she also can sniff it out from the Republican side, which is why she supported Trump. I think it's interesting to see what Bobby Kennedy will do. I'm hoping he will follow through and take on Big Pharma. And more importantly, he'll be a constant reminder to Trump, you've got to declassify the files to get at who is the International Assassination Bureau.
Mm-hmm.
Now, as far as some of the ones that I'm not so sold on, I think we'll see Mike Waltz may turn out to be okay. Because what my thinking is, and what I've been told, is that Trump is going to make the ultimate decisions, as opposed to delegating authority, which he did too much in the last time. And so we already saw with Waltz a slight shift where he came out fairly strong on stopping the war in Ukraine. That's Trump's first issue. If he's going to be serious, he's going to have to follow through on that, and I think he intends to. We saw it with Rubio. Rubio is someone who I wouldn't trust at all.
No.
But Rubio's first statement when he was named as the nominee for Secretary of State was, we've got to stop the war in Ukraine. But then what did he follow it up with? So he can be prepared for the war with China. And so this is the problem with the neocons in general. That there may not be a total skunk like a Bolton or a Pompeo in this group, but I'm not sure that we have the dream team that's needed. And that's why it's important that in the Justice Department, with the FBI, you have someone who's not just loyal to Trump, but someone who will go out and fight and knock these guys out. And that's really the crucial factor. And that's why you see the panic in the establishment, because they're terrified that someone like Tulsi Gabbard knows the situation in Syria. So she met with Assad. Well, Trump met with Kim Jong-un.
Right.
As Yitzhak Rabin said, the way you get peace is you have to make friends with your enemies. You don't have to bother making friends with your friends. And you have to know what the opponents or the adversaries are about. But you also have to have a confidence in yourself that you're not going to be swayed by the power of someone else. But you actually can have a dialogue, an honest dialogue. Where are the diplomats today? And that's where I'm still a little worried. I see the name Rick Grenell constantly coming up. He's been tough on some of these things, but again, you don't know fully where he stands. I've seen some good from J.D. Vance, especially on the military and the war, but I worry about his connection with Palantir and Peter Thiel. So, this is our country. The problem is that power has been in the hands of the corporate cartels, the billionaires, the ones who control the media, the think tanks, the academic world. And until that changes, and that's something the president can't do alone. No. He can certainly provide leadership. But that's what the average person has to do is stay on guard and make sure that we're given the opportunity to shape the government as citizens, as opposed to be spectators who eventually pay the price for negligence.
Harley, I get a lot of pushback when I talk to folks about you do have a say in things and you shouldn't remain silent. You should voice your concerns to those at the local, the regional, the state, and the federal level about you're watching them and that you're going to hold them accountable for what happens or what doesn't happen. And here are the important issues on your plate. Many people say that's an exercise in futility. They don't listen, and they're not going to do anything based on what you try to tell them, or a group that you assemble, you and your friends and your families and your coworkers who present this information to, quote, elected representatives. Is it an exercise in futility? Are the critics of what I have proposed people do, are they right, or is there some power in people speaking up?
No, they're not right. I've talked with a number of congressmen who say that if you get one angry call or two letters or something like that, it can be ignored. But if there's enough volume,
Mm-hmm.
if enough people are speaking up and they're speaking up clearly and defining their concerns, then the staff starts paying attention, and then it comes to the elected official having to deal with it. But you see, the problem is we've become so pessimistic
Yeah.
because we've had one bad administration after another.
Mm-hmm.
You know, the Democrats are looking back to the Obama era as a good era, even though most of the problems we have were absolutely there with Obama. And who was the vice president with Obama?
Good old Joe.
When did Ukraine
Yeah.
happen?
Yeah,
That
2014.
was Obama. Syria, 2011.
11. Yeah.
Libya. So the great liberal progressive hero Obama was a somewhat more eloquent presenter of the policies of the establishment and the worst parts of the establishment, and he's been rewarded for that.
Yes, he has.
He's a multimillionaire.
Mm-hmm.
And there are still people who see him as a great figure. But it just shows that delusion is pretty common in our population.
The power of
But
propaganda.
to go back to the point here, what is it that we're looking at, the LaRouche movement, how we're looking at this?
Mm-hmm.
You have two things going on. One is the system of the empire as it came out after World War II is cracking. Mm-hmm. It's breaking down. It started out as an attempt by the British to maintain the British Empire through the Cold War, through making everything about the West versus the Soviet Union. That was what NATO was about. Lord Ismay, the founding General Secretary of NATO, was asked what NATO is, and he said it's to keep America in Europe, to keep the Soviets out, and to keep the Germans down. That hasn't changed, but the British couldn't do it much longer. The turning point for that was the Suez Crisis in 1956, where the British tried to get the United States to join Britain, France, and Israel to attack Egypt because Nasser nationalized the Suez Canal. And Eisenhower, whatever problems he had, was still a patriot and a believer in aspects of non-intervention in other nations' affairs. You don't go to war frivolously. And what Eisenhower said to the British is, you get the hell out of Egypt, or we're going to dump our pound notes, and you're going to have the worst financial crisis ever. And within hours, the British started pulling out. The French started pulling out. It took a little longer for the Israelis. But Eisenhower stood for a certain element of American values. And it showed up again when he gave the farewell address and talked about the power of the military-industrial complex. Kennedy had an element of that, and both of them reflected more of the bipartisan World War II leadership around Roosevelt, Franklin Roosevelt. Whatever else people think about Franklin Roosevelt, he provided calm leadership during the war. And his ideas for the post-war period were sabotaged by the British. Mm-hmm. And then what happened is that after Johnson came in, you had the inflation, you had a shift of the economy from what Kennedy was trying to do with science and technology, physical economic advances, productivity growth. That stopped. And by the British run on the dollar in the late 60s, the inflation, Nixon's August 1971 decision to take the dollar off gold reserve, that led to a floating exchange rate which opened the door for a speculative economy. Mm-hmm. At the same time, the Republicans were pushing very hard for a deregulation of banking, deregulation of finance, and by the mid-1980s, the Democrats joined them. Mm-hmm. And it got worse because the Democrats came under the influence of Tony Blair, the so-called Third Way. Mm-hmm. The Republicans became the neocons. But the first neocons were the Democrats. It was Scoop Jackson. Mm-hmm. Wolfowitz was a Democrat. Mm-hmm. So you had the merger of neocon Democrats, most of whom had been Trotskyites, by the way, like Norman Podhoretz and Irving Kristol came out of the Trotsky communist movement in World War II.
And Irving's boy,
William Kristol,
Bill Kristol, people think is this conservative. No, 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 no. He is truly a syndicate, not only player, but that's where he was hatched.
Well, the merger of the neocon military view and neoliberal economics, globalization, free trade. The fact that we have a global economy is real. But to then say that the global economy means you have a government over and above national governments, that's the only way to manage it. And that's what the Great Reset was about. That's what the fight against sovereignty. I mean, Walt Wriston wrote a book called The Twilight of Sovereignty. He was the head of Citibank. He provided Robert Rubin, who ended up running the Clinton administration in terms of economic policy. So you had this Anglophile movement that took over both parties. But in order in the Cold War for it to work, it had to be anti-communist. When the communist world broke down, and you had an opportunity to bring in Russia and Eastern Europe into a real Western style, the better aspects of the Western economy. Instead, they sent in the bankers. They sent in the George Soros crowd. And they looted the hell out of Russia. And they made they lied to the Russians about, we're not going to extend NATO 1 inch eastward. And so we're living with the effects of the Wolfowitz, Cheney, and George W. Bush. But who was directing this? It was coming from London. Sir Richard Dearloffe provided the fake report on weapons of mass destruction. I've had a chance recently to talk with Larry Wilkerson, who was the aide to Colin Powell. He said Powell knew that there was something wrong with these documents. And I said, he just knew, or didn't you really know? And he said, well, I knew. And he said the idea that Powell was going to go to the UN and hold up these British lying documents as an excuse to send Americans to die and to kill in Iraq. For him, that was a turning point. Now, you then look at the last 24 years since 2001, since the 9/11, the emergence of the security state, the attack on our freedom, the surveillance state, the censorship state. Why are they censoring? Well, because they don't want opposition to this corporate control that is not only against the sovereignty of countries in the developing sector, they don't want the United States to be sovereign. The ultimate goal, and this is what people miss when they talk about globalization and the Great Reset, they miss the idea that what they're moving towards, or let's say what they're moving away from, is the idea of representative government.
That's right.
That the people have too much power and influence on elected officials, so you need something above that, a technocracy. This is what Brzezinski talked about. This is what justified, in Brzezinski's eyes, that the U.S. could support terrorists that became Taliban and Al-Qaeda in Afghanistan. So we're paying the price of the shift from the post-John Kennedy period, and especially when Nixon was brought down, and I think it's fairly conclusive that there was a coup against Nixon, which included some of the same people in the CIA that were probably involved in killing John Kennedy and covering it up. But what happened then? Well, you had this merger in the 80s of the neocons in both parties. And that's where we are today. And, we still haven't had a national debate on whether we should be spending hundreds of billions of dollars in a losing effort, putting us on the edge of a nuclear war with Russia. And this is where I think if Trump is going to do his job, we'll know it pretty quickly if he follows through on the Ukraine question. And they're doing everything they can to try and convince him that you can't do that. But this is where the question of U.S. and Europe also comes in. And of course, I'm here in Germany, so I have a ringside seat, so to speak, on what's happening in Europe. And look what's happening. The day after Trump got elected, the German government collapsed. A month later, the French government collapsed. You had a vote in Romania where a Trump-type Republican or Trump-type candidate was the majority, and the European Union went in and said, well, it wasn't a democratic vote, so we're going to cancel the election in the name of democracy.
Right.
You have the attempt to have a color revolution in Georgia. So they're not giving up. And then on top of that, what we see in the Middle East right now, where Biden is giving Netanyahu everything he wants, and what people miss on this is they say, well, it's Israel is dictating the policy to the United States. No, it's the Anglo-Americans who are using Israel the same way they're using Ukraine. And the key point there is who's being targeted. All the countries in that area that are moving toward the BRICS, moving away from the petrodollar system, looking for an alternative to the weaponization of the dollar. And my point on that, and this is an important point, then we can have more of a discussion. I'm sorry to go on.
No, this is great, Harley. This is a great dissection.
I think when people hear the term de-dollarization, including Donald Trump, it gets their hackles up because they start thinking these are countries moving against us. No, they're not moving against the American people.
No.
They're moving against the bankers and the hedge funds and the BlackRocks because they've been victims of these bankers.
Yeah.
You have three countries that I've sort of adopted as to fight for is Mali, Burkina Faso, and Niger. Three countries in what's used to be called French West Africa. They all had military coups in the last 3 years. And what did they do? They kicked out the French. Their currencies were still based on the French franc, even though the French gave up the franc. And Niger is one of the largest producers of uranium on the planet. Most of that uranium was going to France for about a nickel on the dollar of its actual price. So the people of Niger got nothing. 70% of French electricity came from uranium, most of which was from Niger. And less than 25% of the people in Niger have regular access to electricity. So that's the neo-imperial policy, neo-colonial policy. All of a sudden, they stood up and said, get the hell out. And I think this is why Macron is pounding his chest, saying we're going to put boots on the ground in Ukraine, because the French Foreign Legion was kicked out of Africa. And he's a little afraid if they're hanging around in Paris, they may pull a coup against him. So it's a fascinating situation now. And we just had a conference last weekend, the Schiller Institute. And one of the people who spoke there was the recent foreign minister of South Africa, Naledi Pandor, who's the one who famously told off Tony Blinken when he went there and told her, well, you're not sufficiently democratic yet because you don't have the full support of the LGBTQ community. And she put her finger in his face and said, Mr. Secretary, you may not know this, but we are a sovereign country. So don't come here to bully us to do what you want us to do. She knows what the rules-based order is, and most of the world does. And we're isolated. And again, not the American people.
No.
I see this because I do a lot of work in media in Africa and Asia. And they like the United States. They wish they could have what we have, but they don't want to have our deep state because they've already had it. And so we're at a point now where we have to choose, are we going to go to war with Russia and China as they're moving toward a new economic system, which is actually more like the American system than we have? Or can we make the decision to negotiate with them and to work side by side with them? And that's what the fight's going to be in the first 6 months of the Trump administration. Will he be pulled into a fight against Russia and China? Or will he stand firm and say those fights that we've been involved in from the neocons are not our business? And I think that will tell us a lot.
Harley, is it accurate to say that with the BRICS-based system and what they've been discussing from a trading system and a clearing system, that it's a more of a, if you will, a physical-based system that they're in the process of developing. Is that a fair statement?
Absolutely.
Okay,
And
so then,
you
so recently, Donald Trump made the statement that, and particularly kind of pointed his finger at the BRICS countries, right? And essentially said, if you're going to come up with another currency or a trading system, well, if you want to sell your goods in the United States, you better back off of that, right? Now, Harley, to me, that statement was very concerning. But
you know how
am I often being concerned about that?
Well, you know how the Russians saw it? This is very interesting. They asked Sergei Lavrov, the Russian foreign minister, about it. And Lavrov said, well, he may have a point there, but we're not about to introduce a new currency.
Yeah.
And Putin said the same thing.
Uh-huh.
Now, what Putin talked about, Putin gave a fascinating speech about 2 weeks ago, where he said, look, we're talking about a polyphonic system where all voices are heard, not a replacement of a one mono system with another mono system. And what Putin and others are talking about, and one of Putin's top economists is Sergei Glaziev, who's very familiar to people with LaRouche because he said LaRouche was the best economist in the last century. What Glaziev is saying is, look, the world can't make a shift completely away from the dollar. But neither can we survive if the dollar is used as a weapon against other countries.
Right.
And what Glaziev and Putin both said is that the people who control the dollar right now are going to turn it into a weapon against the American people as well. And Putin's saying, yeah. And what he's saying is that Trump needs to know that, because Trump is the one who can protect the American people from the weaponization of the dollar against them. Because how are they going to cover $35 trillion in debt?
They can't, Harley. Because let's face it, if you're $35, $36 trillion in debt, how do you get out of it? Well, you can grow out of it. Harley, we're not going to grow out of $36 trillion of debt. You can default on it. Okay, good luck there. Or the third option is you create enough funny money that's worth nothing to pay off the debts in essential monopoly money.
And you just create more debt in the future.
And you create more debt in the future.
Well, there's another option. It's called reorganization. You do a total evaluation, firm by firm, state by state, and figure out which companies, for example, may be staying in business because of liquidity, funny money flowing to them, but are they potentially solvent? This is a key, something I learned from LaRouche is the difference between liquid and solvency. You can keep a bankrupt firm going with liquidity, but it doesn't do any good for the economy.
No.
If a firm is not solvent, then it should be dismantled, sold off, and cover as much of the debt as you can, and that's that. And if there was funny business in it, you put people in prison. But if a firm has a good product and a good idea and is solvent, but because it got into some problems with debt, with commercial real estate, with almost all of the big corporations took the cheap money they got and bought stock. So they look pretty good on paper right now. What happens if something happens with the stock market? So you need a bankruptcy reorganization that doesn't give anybody favoritism. Everyone has to face that. And that's connected to a re-regulation of banking. Most, the argument against regulation, a lot of it's legitimate. A lot of regulations were put in for bad reasons, especially on the Green New Deal and things of that sort. But some regulation, the founding fathers gave the power to the Congress to regulate commerce because they saw what happened with the monopolistic system that existed in Great Britain, where the people who were friendly to the monarchs got special deals. And so they tried to set up a system that prevented that. And we have a system now where our banking system at the Federal Reserve level is run by 5 or 6 large private banks. And those are the so-called too big to fail banks.
Mm-hmm.
So they can go blow money like crazy, build up debt, live lives of the worst aspects of billionaires, knowing they're going to get bailed out. But if you fall behind on a house payment because you lose a job
Yeah.
or something happens, you'll be out on the street.
And BlackRock will own your house before nightfall.
That's right. And they'll be renting it to somebody who will be paying twice as much as it cost you.
Yeah.
So this is where the problem is. We have to, LaRouche drafted what he called his 4 laws for the economy. One was re-regulation of banking, which means a modern Glass-Steagall. Mm-hmm. And Trump supported that in 2016. And he got talked out of it by Mnuchin and Gary, whatever his name was, the other Goldman Sachs guy.
Gary Cohen.
Yeah. So, and I haven't heard him talk about Glass-Steagall, but I'd like to know about it. Secondly, a credit system mm-hmm. from a national banking, mm-hmm. Like what Hamilton did. Mm-hmm. Credit for entrepreneurs, for industrialists. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. This is what John Kennedy was doing with the investment tax credit. Mm-hmm. Then heavy investment in infrastructure. Mm-hmm. And our infrastructure is terrible in the mm-hmm. United States. Mm-hmm. It's terrible in Germany. Mm-hmm. Germany used to be known for a great rail system, and it doesn't exist anymore. And then the fourth area is investment, especially in research and development at the frontiers of science, which is what, again, Kennedy was doing, whether it was cancer research, the space program, and so on. Now, if you have those 4 laws governing your economic policy, you don't need to have billions of regulations or laws, and who is it that knows how to run that kind of system? The small town bankers, mm-hmm. regional bankers. Mm-hmm. They know who's credit worthy or not. Mm-hmm. And with the deregulation of the savings and loans in the 80s, they were forced to compete with the commercial bankers and especially the big city guys from New York and San Francisco. And that's why the savings and loans went bankrupt. Essentially, that was a good model. It provided housing for and the buildup of a middle class. What we're seeing is a collapse of the middle class, mm-hmm. and that's why there's a growing inequality between the rich and poor. So and these are the 2 areas, if Trump delivers on getting out of the Ukraine war mm-hmm. and figures out why you can't give Israel a free hand. I don't know if people have heard this, but in the last 2 days, Israel launched over almost 400 bombing raids. Mm-hmm. They destroyed the Syrian Navy. Mm-hmm. They knocked out 80% of Syria's military capability. Now, is that because they think the jihadists would take that and go against them? Well, that would be a good bet. Mm-hmm. But why did they then help the jihadists come in?
No, that's key. Because when you look at the situation in Syria, Harley, right? Yeah. The main players behind the, let's call them Al-Qaeda in suits, right, yeah. are the following. The United States, the Brits through MI6, Israel, and Turkey, correct?
And don't forget the French. The
French too.
Working with
the 5, the big 5.
Because Lebanon and Syria were the French mandates under mm-hmm. Sykes-Picot. Mm-hmm. No, you're absolutely right. And Netanyahu thinks it's very clever because he got rid of some of what he said were his enemies. Mm-hmm. But where's the solution there? What are you going to do with the Palestinians? You still have a couple million Palestinians. What's going to happen with them? Well, if you listen to Ben Gvir and Smotrich and the settler extremists, they're going to be forced to leave or they're going to be killed. And can the United States really support that? Well, we have been mm-hmm. under Biden. Mm-hmm. And I'm hoping that even though Trump may be inclined to support Israel, that he'll recognize that killing off a whole people is not a way to provide security for Israel.
Harley, what's your take? Why, Assad was an ally of Russia, of Iran. Why did we see Syria fall in essentially a week and a half, without significant pushback, if you will, from Putin and Iran. The thought that you've heard kicked around is, well, they're just so strung out in Ukraine. Which, again, I'm not buying this, but what's been said is they're so strung out in Ukraine and financially that they didn't. That's why they didn't come to Assad's rescue or defense. What's Harley Schlanger's take?
Well, let's start by recognizing that there's no such thing as a local crisis. Right. It's not just a crisis in the Middle East.
Right.
We're dealing with a new global great game.
Mm-hmm.
That's the fight. And the American brain trust around Blinken and Sullivan and the Atlantic Council and the CFR, what they're pointing to is Eurasia. Mm-hmm. They're saying that the question is Eurasia because that's where there's land, that's where there's raw materials, and that's where Russia and China are the dominant power. And they're terrified that the Europeans are going to wake up one morning and say, why are we stuck with the Anglo-Americans when we could be trading with Russia and China? Mm-hmm. So Ukraine was a choice to try to weaken Russia. Mm-hmm. The situation around Israel, well, that's targeting Iran, that's targeting the states in the area, but it wasn't, I made the joke today in my update that this was an overnight lightning strike, 23 years in the making.
Right, yeah.
This goes back to the memo or the classified document that General Wesley Clark was given mm-hmm. that identified 7 states in that region that had to be overturned.
Yeah, they thought they were going to do it in 5 years, right?
Yeah. Now, what was the issue with Syria? Mm-hmm. Well, Assad was one of the last moderate governments that respected women's rights, that had a good health care system. Syria had food surplus. It was a generally well-run country at a point at which the United States was targeting Iraq and Iran. And Assad is an Alawite, which is a moderate Shia branch of Islam, but the Christians were protected in Syria. Mm-hmm. The Jews were protected in Syria, and it was an exception to what was happening. The other exception was Lebanon, but Lebanon was beaten down by Israel, by Sharon's constant attacks, and that's where Hezbollah came from. Mm-hmm. Hezbollah was a defensive protection of the Shia minority inside Lebanon. Now, and Syria was never attacking Israel mm-hmm. after 67 and 73. So why Syria? Well, because Syria was a potential location or entry point for Russia in the Middle East. And why did they turn to Russia? Because they were being attacked by this American attempt to destroy what they called the axis of resistance. But what was the basis of that? It was Palestine. Mm-hmm. What are you going to do about Palestine? And so we have these wounds that go deep, mm-hmm. very deep. And, I see these people say, well, Israel had to do something about October 7th. And there's a certain sympathy for that if you are attacked like that, well, yeah, you have to defend yourself. But it didn't start on October 7th. No. It goes back decades. Mm-hmm. And, it's not a question until there's a ceasefire and an end, then you can have a reconciliation process. But you've got to stop the fighting. Mm-hmm. And, the saying, vengeance is mine, saith the Lord. Mm-hmm. Bibi Netanyahu is not the Lord, mm-hmm. although he thinks he is.
He thinks he is, yeah, right.
So you ask about what happened in Syria. This was a long-term project to overturn what was a potentially viable state. Mm-hmm. And especially recently, with Russia and China moving into the Middle East, mm-hmm. China brokered a deal between Iran and Saudi Arabia. This was the center of the Shia versus Sunni. Mm-hmm. And all of a sudden, they make a deal. And then the deal includes oil to China for yuan. The potential for Iran to be brought back into trade and off sanctions. Now, the other thing about Syria is what really killed the Assad government was the Caesar sanctions. The fact that the lies about chemical weapons use, and this came from British intelligence, the White Helmets and the Syrian organization for something, I can't remember the exact title. It's a two-person operation funded by millions of pounds from the British Foreign Office. And they were the ones who put out these reports about torture and killing. And of course, what happened is when you get in a civil war, then there is killing. Because Assad was defending his country. But who is he defending it from? Those weren't Syrians. They were Libyans. They were people from Chechnya. People
they were mercenaries.
People from Iraq who came in and tore that country apart. And as the standard of living dropped, and then, of course, the United States took the oil fields. So the oil revenue was no longer going in. They had no fuel. So the standard of living and the lives of people suffered terribly. And I think what actually happened is Assad spoke with Erdogan. He talked with Putin. Putin and Erdogan talked, and they basically said that we should convince Assad to leave, otherwise there'll be a bloodbath. And I think Assad made a tough decision to leave, not just because his army was weakened, but because he did not want to see another 10 years of war. And at some point in the future, people may look back on that and see that as his best moment, that he held the country together when he could. Hopefully, we're not going to have head choppers running Syria. Head choppers.
Well,
in suits.
If their track record is going to give us a foreshadowing of what's going to happen, I think there's going to be a fair amount of head chopping, Harley.
Well, there are other militia groups, including some that the United States is still funding and training. You mentioned Turkey. Turkey helped train the Hayat Tahrir al-Sham. They helped train them. This was not a ragtag militia.
No.
They had tanks, they had drones, they had sophisticated equipment and
training. They had recon, they had intel.
Yeah, and that included Ukrainian technicians. And so I think from that standpoint, when people are saying all of a sudden Assad was so brutal, he was so terrible, he was defending his country. It's interesting to me that people who will argue that Netanyahu's genocide of the Palestinians is justified because he's defending the country, then turn around and say, well, Assad was a brutal dictator killing everybody. There's hypocrisy. And the hypocrisy is that people have this view, this local view, and they can't get above it. And that's the media reinforces that.
Harley, is it possible that Putin can utilize what happened in Syria as a means of helping end the war in Ukraine?
Well, I think this is going to take some work with Trump to do that. And if you look at what Putin said from the beginning, he said his intention was to make sure that there was not a hostile, well-armed force on the borders of Russia. And a hostile, well-armed force that was killing Ukrainians. Because in the Donbass, everyone says, well, these were Russians who were being killed. They were ethnic Russians, but some of those ethnic claims go back hundreds of years. They were Ukrainians. The Ukrainians were killing their own citizens. And Putin stepped forward and said, we're not going to let that happen. And that was what the Minsk Accord was about, to try and stop that. And the Merkel and Hollande admitted that they lied when they signed that accord because they had no intention of fulfilling it. So when you look at the position Putin was in, who could he trust? And on top of that, Biden was the one who authorized the coup in Ukraine in 2014 and sent in Victoria Nuland, and whose husband, by the way, is one of those old neocons from the Kagan family, which goes back to the Crystals and the Podhoretz and the hardcore neocons.
And who was linked with the Washington Post, right? Who recently threw a hissy fit that when Bezos said we're not endorsing Kamala Harris.
Yeah. So you've got rotten networks all over the place.
Yeah,
and so
one stinking mess.
And then Putin is looking at the new government in Great Britain, Starmer. He's sort of like a Tony Blair light. And Sunak was a Margaret Thatcher light.
Mm-hmm.
You know, you have no statesman. Macron lies, and now we're seeing also, Dave, I don't know if you're paying attention to this, but look what just happened in Japan and South Korea. In October, the Kishida government was voted out because it was so unpopular, because it was supporting global NATO. And now Yoon in South Korea is probably going to be impeached.
Yeah, martial law, right? Martial law for an hour or whatever he tried.
And so what you have is the establishment in the so-called wealthy nations, or the G7, is collapsing. It's lost its mandate from heaven. But we don't have an alternative in place yet. And people are scared of the BRICS. And people are scared of Putin and Xi. And they see them as the strong men emerging over the horizon. And they don't read their speeches. They're not listening to them. One of the saving graces of our civilization, and I never thought I'd say this, might be Tucker Carlson with his interviews with Putin and Lavrov, especially with Lavrov. I don't know if you saw that. Lavrov came across as a very articulate, mild-mannered, thoughtful person. And you compare that with Blinken.
No. Yeah.
And
it's tiddlywinks versus chess there.
Yeah.
So Harley, you've been very generous with your time. In our concluding minutes here, let's look ahead geopolitically. And let's hit a couple pieces on the chessboard of where you think this is going to go. And what you see President Trump doing with his administration, or what he should be doing to move the chess pieces around the chessboard so that no big booms occur, right? So let's start with Russia-Ukraine. The best move President Trump could do from this point forward, going into Inauguration Day and immediately after.
Go talk to Putin.
Yeah.
Not worry about what's said in the New York Times or the Washington Post. Talk to Putin and see why Putin is saying it's not enough to have this as a Korea-style frozen conflict. And Putin has no intention of taking over the rest of Ukraine. What he wants is that it's a neutral country, which is what was the agreement initially from Minsk. And if he can talk about that with Trump, Trump is smart enough to know that rather than another war that could become a nuclear war, let's settle this. And Zelensky is a problem. But Zelensky's only a problem because he's supported by all of the idiots in Europe.
That's right.
Now, in Europe, there are going to be elections in Germany in February. The front runner is Friedrich Merz of the Christian Democrats, who is the head of BlackRock in Europe. So, we're not out of the woods yet in Germany. Although I will say that if one of the key things would be for Trump to send Rick Grenell to talk to the Germans, because he was the acting ambassador here for a while. He's trusted by people, and he's a fairly thoughtful guy. Maybe J.D. Vance will have a role to play in talking with the Europeans. But the problem with Europe is they're terrified that Trump will cut the cord with them. And they're talking big. We're going to have a European defense force. They don't even have bullets.
Yeah.
They can't afford to pay their police salaries in France. It's a mythology that NATO somehow represents the saving grace for Europe. So I think Trump knows that, and he is trolling the European leaders very effectively. But I think if he were to sit down with Putin and work out an agreement, which includes no NATO for Ukraine, security guarantees for Russia and Ukraine, and that the weapons that have been, the offensive weapons that have been provided will be withdrawn, I think you could have an agreement. And the people of Ukraine want it. 58% are now saying they want the war to end. So I think that's something that's achievable, maybe not in 24 hours,
No.
but it's something that's achievable in the weeks ahead.
Best moves he can make in the weeks ahead in the Middle East.
Well, I think he has to tell Netanyahu that the killing has to stop.
Yeah.
And I think he's again going to have to talk to Putin about how to stabilize the situation in Syria. I don't think we need a U.S. presence there. The U.S. presence in the Mideast has always been bad for us.
It sure has.
You know, remember what happened in Lebanon with the troops when Reagan was president.
Beirut bombing.
And what we have to say to Israel is that we'll make sure you're safe, but we're not going to give you the offensive power to go in and destroy the region. And I think what's going to happen in Israel is that if we get to a point of a ceasefire, Netanyahu will be gone. Now, that doesn't mean good people will come in, but the Israeli population had been completely pulled into the war policy by October 7th. And some of that was legitimate self-defense concerns. Some of it was just lying. They were lied to about what happened. But I think that that situation has to be cooled. Erdogan has to be told to stay out of Syria. The Turks have no role in there. And then you need to send an envoy to meet with the new president of Iran, Pezeshkian, who's somewhat of a moderate and who would actually be open to the idea of guaranteeing no nuclear weapons for Iran in return for lifting of some of the sanctions. Now, that's the other thing. Instead of using sanctions, and Trump was a little bit too quick to put sanctions on countries and individuals in his last term, sanctions are a war policy. So how can you say you're against war, but then you carry out economic warfare against a country? There are better ways to make deals. And hopefully that's what he'll try to do.
Best moves he can make in the coming weeks, China, Taiwan.
Meet with Xi Jinping. I was kind of impressed by the fact that he invited Xi to the inaugural. I mean, that showed some chutzpah.
Frankly, he should also invite Putin.
Well,
can you imagine? Can you imagine if he did that?
Putin might get arrested.
Well.
Because of the warrant out against him. But no, the thing with when Trump met with Xi in his first term, he came back from China totally impressed with what he saw with the infrastructure and impressed with Xi. He still says Xi is one of the smartest people he knows. So I'm hoping that those big power relations will stay out of the hands of the neocons. And that's really where the rubber meets the road. If you turn it over to the neocons, and by the way, I think the military, senior Pentagon officials are much more sane than the politicians. They were the ones who told Biden not to give the go-ahead to Zelensky to use these long-range missiles. And that freaked out Blinken and Sullivan. But I think there's you have on the one side the woke military and the crazy military like Admiral Buchanan, but you also have people who are still involved in fighting in Afghanistan and Iraq, who know what it means when you send a young person into battle to get killed. And that's my other hope, is that we'll have people in the military who will talk to the Russians, talk to the Chinese. That's what the French are doing, by the way. The French have opened a channel of communication with the Chinese military, the French military, around the back of Macron.
Harley, final question. What are the odds that on the way out the door, not Biden, but the people around Biden, are going to try to burn the building down? In a sense that we already just saw, just today, them sending 6 more long-range United States-directed long-range missiles deep into Russia, what are the odds that what they're going to hand over come January 20th is going to be a flaming world in a world war, which is what none of us want, but what they want? What are the odds? What are the odds that they are going to be able to be successful in setting the entire world building on fire?
That partly depends on what Trump does in terms of discussing things with military leaders and others. It also depends on what the military decides to do.
Yeah.
Because what I would argue is that when they, back in June and July, decided to convince Biden not to run for re-election,
Mm-hmm.
they should have removed him from the presidency.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Because if you have someone who can hardly walk, doesn't know where he is half the time, how can you entrust him with the finger on the nuclear button?
Mm-hmm.
So the question is, who has their finger on the nuclear button? And if it's the Obama crowd, the Brzezinski crowd, the Blinken and Sullivan and Susan Rice and Samantha Powers, that's where the danger comes in.
Mm-hmm.
And the danger would come from a false flag.
Mm-hmm.
You know, we're still hearing that the Ukrainians are trying to build a dirty bomb and blow it up in Ukraine and blame it on the Russians. So there's a real possibility that something like that could happen. And then it's a question of, are there cooler heads along the lines of what John Kennedy did in the Cuban Missile Crisis? Or will we have the Colonel Jack Ripper from the Kubrick movie, I'm forgetting the name now, Dr. Strangelove.
Strangelove, yeah.
Yeah. If the Strangeloves control the White House at the last minute, we could be in a nuclear war.
Harley, folks need to keep up with your efforts 24/7. What's the best way for them to do that?
Well, two things. One, people who are really interested in more in depth are welcome to write to me, to my personal email. It's harleysch@gmail.com. And I have a lot of your fans, Dave, who are in touch with me from time to time. But the other thing, every day, 5 days a week, I do a 12-minute update, a political update, economic update from the standpoint of history. What we've been talking, the way we've been talking. It's a short video. It's available usually by about 8 a.m. in the morning in the United States. And you can find it at the LaRoucheOrganization.com. That's the website, and you click on the where it says programs at the bar on the top, and the first thing that pops up is Harley's Daily Update. So that's the best way to get it, because Facebook periodically lets me get up to 20,000 views, and then the next week it's down to 2,000 or 1,000.
I know the feeling, Harley.
Yeah, we all do.
Harley, I'd like to thank you for everything you have done, are doing, and continue to do. Our world is a much safer and better place because of your efforts, which are really on a 24/7 basis. And I thank you, Harley, for your perseverance, dedication, and sacrifice.
Well, thank you, Dave, and I appreciate the chance to have these discussions.
I do too, Harley. You're quite a friend. A friend for actually every person in the world. But I'm blessed to have you as my friend as well. And I thank you folks for joining us. Until next time, Dave Janda signing off. Dream big and dare to fail. Thanks for your time today.